So that puts into context of why we need intensive management to manage our wetlands for the best possible resources for the waterfowl. And I'll do an introduction here on more soil management. Some water. So I'll introduce an idea of some definitions here. Active management is kind of defined as the control of wetland succession through water manipulation, regular soil disturbance, and control of undesirable plants to meet objectives. There's also a suite of infrastructure that goes along with it, such as stop boards, berms, and ditches. Wetlands are seasonally drawn down. They tend to be shallow. And that's opposed to passive management. And that has minimal to no control of water, soil, and plants, and allowing wetland succession to occur. I'll go a little bit more into the idea of wetland succession a little bit later. But you can see here, this wetland is dominated with cattails, which is a very persistent emergent wetland plant, and I'm sure you're familiar with. It grows in areas that stay wet year-round without any management of your own. It'll often grow. And then there's something called convenience management, where you might know what you need to do on that wetland, but it doesn't. And you might manipulate water, soil, and vegetation, but not necessarily at the right timing, not the right rate, or not the right amount. And so you might know how it goes. You might be out enjoying the water. There's plenty of water, so you're not worried about it. And then sometimes you don't have water, and all of a sudden the ducks are coming in and they think, oh shoot, I better go out there and mow my impoundments. And that's convenience management. So what we want to strive for is active management. And there's a technique called moist soil management, which we've been talking about. Moist soil management is an active management of shallow water impoundments, and it simulates natural seasonal wetlands on the floodplain or on the in augmentation ponds or whatnot. And the goal is to maximize food production for waterfowl and shorebirds. They tend to be flooded in the fall and the winter, dried throughout the spring and the summer, and we apply occasional soil and vegetation disturbance to maintain early wetland succession. So there's that term again, wetland succession. Active or more soil management, there's a lot of benefits to that. It provides quality habitat to meet the life history traits that John had been talking about. It maximizes wildlife benefits and use on limited acreage. And so we all have limited acreage that we're working with, and we want to maximize what we can get out of that. Another benefit for active management is it can lead to improved recreation and economic potential by improving duck use on your properties. And seasonal and moist soil management can mimic lost wetland functions by introducing flooding to the floodplain. On the other hand, moist soil management requires increased time on the landowner or the manager, increased costs, of course, and while it mimics, it doesn't replace all wetland natural types and functions. It's just one type of wetland, and John and Brian were talking about there's a variety of wetland types out here that it won't replace. This is the slide that Brian showed earlier, and it shows where waterfowl populations are during different seasons. In the fall, in October and November, they tend to be found on large reservoirs, roosting in reservoirs, and feeding in other wetlands. So, as the winter progresses, things start to freeze up, and they start to use river and floodplain more. The river stays open during the winter for the most part, and there's more and more sloughs stay open. So they use the river and floodplain for roosting, and they'll feed in ag lands. So if you think about what the limiting factor is for waterfowl during each season, they have plenty of open water for roosting, but their feeding areas is the more limited area. And that's when they need to get the energetic input for migration. During the winter, they'll have lot of food in the agricultural areas when they switched to that, but their more limited factor during that season is open water. And so you can think about your properties and you can think about what you're able to offer to the waterfowl during each season. And so what we ought to be focusing a lot on today's talks is the providing energetic resources in the fall migration. With active management wetlands, various studies in Texas, Mississippi, and Oregon, and Washington have found that you can have much higher increases in seed production in active managed wetlands rather than passively managed wetlands. So you can see in actively managed wetlands in Texas, they found an average of 526 pounds per acre versus 49 pounds per acre. Mississippi, 442 pounds per acre versus 140 pounds per acre. Oregon and Washington, a study in those states found 683 pounds per acre opposed to 311 pounds per acre on passively managed or unmanaged wetlands. And by actively managed wetlands, we're talking about disking, and we're talking about drawing down water, and various things that we're going to talk about later. And how does that pounds per acre convert to waterfowl use? Then some of these studies, they actually measured the amount of waterfowl use on the actively managed versus unmanaged or passively managed wetlands. In Texas, some of the Platte potholes have found 16 times higher use, over 1,000 times higher waterfowl use in those areas. A study on WRPs in New York, 650% higher waterfowl use on those WRPs. Missouri, 50% higher. Mississippi, 190% higher. It almost seems, I don't know if there's any correlation there, but the wetter areas that might have more wetlands around, you might not get as much benefit out of active management because there are a lot of natural wetlands. But in the drier areas like Texas and maybe New Mexico and northeast Colorado, where it is drier naturally, I think you can get much more bang for your buck with active management rather than not managing your wetlands. And this is an example of what we want to see out there. Seasonal wetland can get really high use. So moisture management, as I said, it simulates natural seasonal wetlands. And I introduced the idea of wetland succession. Wetland succession is the aging of a wetland from being dominated by primarily annual plants, which are the ones that reproduce and sprout each year. They don't live from one year to the next. To being converted to a wetland that's dominated by persistent emergent wetlands like wetland plants like cattails, and eventually it could get taken over by willows and cottonwoods. That's a natural progression. You don't have to do anything, and it'll move in that direction if it stays wet too long. And our goal with moisture management is to try to move that back to the earlier phase in the succession stage. And how does that happen naturally? We're simulating a natural process. This happens naturally. And it's linked to large flood events in the river system. This is the South Platte data from 1918 to 1927 out of the Balzac gauge, which I think is not active anymore. But historically, there have been some large floods. It tends to happen in June. And I've eliminated the 1928 flood out of here because it really threw it out of whack. But besides just the hydrograph that shows runoff, the variability in flooding is also what we need to pay attention to. 1921, over 30,000 CFS that ran through. 1965 flood, close to 28,000 CFS. And occasionally the floods happen early in the season, sometimes later in the season. And what this flooding does, it creates large flood events that floods the floodplain. This is South Platte 1965. Got some photographs off the internet. At 27,000 CFS approximately. And what do these floods bring with them? They bring a lot of woody debris. And there's a lot of scouring events that go on. It takes out vegetation. Where areas that there were cattails, it clears that out. And what are you left with? as the river starts going back down, you got big mud flats out there. It's pure, just plain mud and dirt. And you get braided channels. You get some backwater areas with mud flats. And these are perfect areas for annual plants to start growing. There's a seed bank that's already there. It's been there. It's brought in by waterfowl. And it's the same plants that waterfowl rely on when they come back to feed on the seeds in the fall. Brian showed some of these slides, 1938 versus 1998. And this is part of the South Platte in Nebraska. But historically, large braided channels, whereas now you see more of a single stem system that meanders that through. And you bet, some of these areas were back channels that had cattails and small oxbows. But now they're getting filled in with woody vegetation, cottonwoods. These are areas that have smooth brome in them now, cheatgrass, and all of our other floodplain plants. They don't get cleared out like they used to. Another example showing a highly braided stream to a stream with much fewer, deeper channels, much more woody components. And some old 1880 diagrams that show, there were some cattails along the edges, but you had wide expanses of mud flats and shallow water, much less woody vegetation. And in Nebraska, they're actually going into their river and they're disking up the river to maintain it in an early successional state. Now,
so they're just taking a discount in the river?
Yeah.
What's the core say? I guess it's not filling, is it?
It's not fill, actually. You're right. Ducks Unlimited and Parks and Wildlife are doing some sandbar clearing on the South Platte, which is a similar program. And the South Platte does function. It does flood. It does have a floodplain, and it produces what we call moist soil plants. This pink one here is smartweed. It's hard to see, but there is barnyard grass, which has a high energetic food value in the seeds, and a plant called chufa, which has both seed value and has underground tubers. They're like little potatoes that ducks and cranes where they occur feed on.
Colin, did you say it does have seed value?
Barnyard grass?
Does the chufa?
It's mostly known for its underground, the rhizomes and tubers.
So these seeds on top don't really help?
John.
Yeah,
The,
it produces a reasonable amount of ground biomass as well. It just becomes, it's not available very long, breaks down relatively quick.
yeah.
But so the plant is just, when people have chufa, they tend to manage a little bit of biomass because they can get a really good, especially if you have geese and cranes in the system, it can be really good geese and cranes. Or if you have turkeys,
Yeah. A lot of these plants produce seed, but they might not be as large, or they don't produce as much seed, so they're all relative to one another. And I do, on the back of one of your worksheets, I do have a list of plants that shows the relative values of various plants based on how much they produce, some of the amino acids they might have in them.
And chufa does okay along the South Platte if it's
There's
present and
yeah.
We have someone Elliott.
There's another plant that looks very similar to it called fragrant flat sedge. It doesn't produce the underground tubers, but it does grow. It looks very similar. So if you can yank them up later in the fall and and see what you might have there. It's actually considered one of the biggest weeds in the West because it grows in alfalfa fields and other flooded fields. And the former biologist at Boston Del Apache actually did a whole master's thesis on how to best grow chufa in managed wetlands, whereas most of the continent is trying to find ways to get rid of it in their ag fields. So what might be great for us is considered weeds a lot of other places. So these seeds are present in the floodplain. They're present in our floodplain floodplain areas. And there's limited acreage on the South Platte. So we can, by creating either og ponds or moist soil units that are off the floodplain, we can increase the amount of these wetland fluids that we can produce. I'm going to go into some of the plants that we're trying to target. So you know what we're talking about throughout the rest of the talks. Barnyard grass or it's also called a natural millet. There is a list on the back of what's your seasonal scorecard, your wetland scorecard sheet. And it ranks food values from 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. And these values will come up based on professional judgment by a number of professors and wetland managers, and based on information published in literature. It's considered one of the best seed values. And these are also ranked based on how good they are for producing invertebrates. And that's also based by the above ground leafy material. There's the red variety or green variety in the seed heads. And it's easy to recognize when they're young because they have the stem grows flat. It's kind of reddish on the bottom. Tufa or yellow nut sedge. These are an example of some of the underground tubers that are on the roots. Considered a food value of 9. Smartweed has this pink inflorescence, and the long lancet leaves and the nodes along the stem. Very good food value. You can see the mature seeds here. There's actually one immature seed there. So as we're talking about these seed values and managing wetlands, we'll also talk about mowing. But later in the season, if you do mow your impoundments, try to get it after the seeds are matured. They'll be nice and black and hard. You don't want to mow these prior to that, or you are giving up that food resource. Sprangletop, another good plant, food value 7. Curly dock, this one grows abundantly out in the seasonal wetlands in South Platte. Easy to recognize with the dark red seed heads later in the summer. Lamb's quarter, we're getting down to about a food value of considered about a 5, but it does have a good leafy, a lot of above ground leafy surface area, which is good for providing a substrate for invertebrates to feed on. Spikerush has very tiny seeds. I think those small seeds are really what teal are going for. It's good food for some of the smaller the species that prefer the smaller waterfowl foods, the smaller seeds. Foxtail barley. A lot of you might recognize that from the wispy seed heads. And it's good to know what young sunflower versus cockerel looks like. When they're young, they both look pretty similar. But if you're trying to look at what you might have to manage for later in the season. Sunflower is considered to have a decent food value. Cockbird, it's not the bottom of the line. It actually has considered a decent value. It's not the worst plant to have out there because it has a large surface area that can produce, again, a substrate for invertebrates to grow on later in the season. So you can see the deeper venation with the sunflower. Yeah, you can, and then these will often have almost lobes. And the serrations will be on larger lobes in the leaves for cocklebur. And kochia has got pretty low food value. The seeds are almost negligible for waterfowl, and the leafy surface areas is not that great for invertebrates. So not one of our best plants out there. It still has value though. We get to some of our persistent emergent plants like cattails. Not great food value. It is create a refuge area for invertebrates to grow, but not one of our more desirable plants. Hard-stem bulrush, also a persistent plant, a later successional stage plant, not one of our target plants. One of our sedges, though, does have pretty decent food value for the seeds, and that's 3-square bulrush. So those are some of the common plants that I see out there, and that we might be talking about. So yeah, our next talk is going to be with John again, going into more detail about moist soil management. Yeah, this is smartly done one of our WRPs, and it is also an augmentation pond. And I'm not kneeling or sitting. I'm not very tall, I have to admit, but it was about 4 foot tall, smart meat out there. So it can produce, recharge and augmentation ponds can be really good production areas if you get the water at the right time of year.
What's the right time of year?
We'll go into that more
Oh, is that John?
specifically, but it tends to be in the spring, mid-April through mid-June.
Okay.